I need to sleep. Alright, let's get started. Alright. Chapter 2. What's up, Bubba? Development of the black slave trade. The black slave trade were, quote, the strength and sinews of this Western world, end quote. Black slavery demanded the black slave trade. Therefore, the preservation and improvement of the trade to Africa was, quote, a matter of very high importance to this kingdom and the plantation thereunto belonging. And thus it remained up to 1783 a cardinal object of British foreign policy. The first English slave trade expeditions was that of Sir John Hawkins in 1562. Like so many Elizabethan ventures, it was a buccaneering expedition, encroaching on a palpable, oh my gosh, I hate that when I can't even say the word right. Look at this word. I had a hard time. Hey, Coco, I had a hard time saying this word yesterday after being told it. Arbitration of 1493, which made Africa a Portuguese monopoly. The slaves obtained were sold to the Spaniards in the Caribbean. The English slave trade remained desultory and perfunctory in the character until the establishment of British colonies in the Caribbean and the introduction of the sugar industry. When by 1660 the political and social upheaval of the Civil War period came to an end, England was ready to embark wholeheartedly on a branch of commerce whose importance to her sugar and her tobacco colonies in the New World was beginning to be fully appreciated. In accordance with the economic policies of the Stuart monarchy, the slave trade was entrusted to monopolistic companies, the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading to Africa, 30 incorporated in 1663 for a period of 1,000 years. The Earl of Clarendon voiced the enthusiasm current at the time that the company would, quote, be found a model equally to advance the trade of England with that of any other company than that of the England Indies. The optimistic prediction was not realized largely as a result of losing and dislocation caused by war with the Dutch, and in 1672 a new company, the Royal African Company, was created. The policy of monopoly, however, remained unchanged and provoked determined resistance in two quarters. The merchants in the outports struggling to break down the monopoly of the capital, and the planters in the colonies demanding free trade in black people as victoriously and with as much gusto as 150 years later they opposed free trade in sugar. The mercantilist intelligentsias were divided on the question. Post-Lithuat, most prolific of the mercantilist writers, wanted the company, the whole company, and nothing but the company. Joshua Gee emphasized the frugality and good management of the private traders. Davant, one of the ablest economists and financial experts of his day, at first opposed the monopoly and then later changed his mind, arguing that other nations found organized companies necessary and that the company would, quote, stand in place of the academy for training an indefinite number of people in the regular knowledge of all matters related to several branches of the African trade. The case against monopoly was succinctly stated by the free traders, the interlopers as they were then called, to the Board of Trade in 1711. The monopoly meant that the purchase of British manufacturers and for sales on the coast of Africa, controlled control of ships, employed in the slave trade, sale of black people to the plantations, importations of plantation produce. Quote, this great circle of trade and navigation, end quote, on which the livelihood, direct and indirect, of many thousand depended, would be under the control of a single company. The planters, in their turn, complained of the quality, prices, and irregular deliveries, and refused to pay their debts to the company. There was nothing unique in this opposition to the monopoly of the slave trade. Monopoly was an ugly word, which conjured up memories of political tyranny of Charles I, though no, quote, free trade of the time could have had the slightest idea of a still uglier vision of the word would conjure up 150 years later, when it was associated with the economic tyranny of the Caribbean sugar planters. But in the last decade of the 17th century, the economic current was flowing definitely against monopoly. In 1672, the Baltic trade was thrown open and the monopoly of Eastland Company overthrown. One of the most important consequences of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the expulsion of the Stuarts, was the impetus it gave to the principle of free trade. In 1698, the Royal African Company lost its monopoly, and the rights of a free trade in slaves was recognized as a fundamental and natural right of Englishmen. In the same year, the merchant adventurers of London were deprived of their monopoly of the export trade in cloth, and a year later, the monopoly of a Muscovy company was abrogated, and trade to Russia made free. Only in one particular did the freedom accorded in the slave trade differ from the freedom accorded in other trades. The commodity involved was man. The Royal African Company was powerless against the competition of the free traders. It soon went bankrupt and had to depend on parliamentary subsidy. In 1731, it abandoned the slave trade and confined itself to the trade in ivory and gold dust. In 1750, a new organization was established called the Company of Merchant Trading to Africa, with a board of 9 directors, 3 each from London, Bristol, and Liverpool. Of the slave traders listed in 1775, 237 belonged to Bristol, 147 to London, and 89 to Liverpool. Hold on a second, let's see who's in here. All right, who's in here? All right, we'll try, but if I don't know if we're getting any. Free trade and the increasing demands of the sugar plantation, the volume of the British slave trade rose enormously. The Royal African Company between 1680 and 1686 transported an annual average of 5,000 slaves. In the first 9 years of free trade, Bristol alone shipped 160,950 black people to the sugar plantations. In 1760, 140 ships sailed from British ports for Africa with a capacity of 36,000 slaves. In 1771, the number of ships had increased to 190, and in the number of slaves to 47,000. The importation into Jamaica from 1700s to 1786 was 610,000. 610,000. And it has been estimated that the total imports of slaves into all the British colonies between 1860s and 1786 was over 2 million. But the slave trade was more than a means to an end. It was also an end in itself. The British slave trader provided the necessary laborers, not only for their own plantations, but for those of their rivals. The encouragement thereby given the foreigners was contrary not only to common sense, but to strict mercantilism. But insofar as this foreign slave trade meant the Spanish colonies, there was some defense for it. Spain was always, up to the 19th century, dependent on foreigners for her slaves, either because she adhered to the palpable arbitration, which included her from Africa, or because of the lack of capital and a necessary good for the slave trade. The privilege of supplying these slaves to the Spanish colonies, called the abestio, became one of the most highly coveted and bitterly contested plums of international diplomacy. British mercantilists defended the trade, legal or illegal, with the Spanish colonies, black people, and manufactured goods as a distinct value, in that the Spaniards paid in coin, and thus the supply of bullion in England was increased. The supplies of slaves to the French colonies could plead no such justification. Here it was clearly a clash of interest between the British slave trader and the British sugar planters, as a trade in the export of British machinery after 1825 led to clash the interest between British shippers and British producers. The sugar planters was right and the slave trade wrong. But in the first half of the 18th century, this was noticed only by the very discerning. Post-Lethoats condemned the Assentio of 1713 was scandalous and ruinous, and in exchange of this substance for the shadow, quote, a treaty could scarce have been contrived of so little benefit to the nation, end quote. During the 9 months of British occupation of Cuba in the 7 Years' War, 10,700 slaves were introduced. Over 1/6 of the importations from 1512 to 1763, over 1/3 of the importations from 1763 to 1789. 40,000 black people were introduced into Guadalupe by the British. In 3 years during the same war, the Privy Council Committee of 1788 paid special attention to the fact that the annual British export of slaves from Africa, 2/3 were disposed of to foreigners. During the whole of the 18th century, according to Byron Edwards, British slave traders furnished the sugar planters of France and Spain with 500,000 black people, justified his doubts of the, quote, the wisdom and policies of this branch of the African commerce, end quote. Britain was not only the foremost slave trade countries in the world, she had become the Ramsay's phrase, the, quote, honorable slave carriers of her rivals. The story of this increase in the slave trade is mainly the story of the rise of Liverpool, Liverpool's first slave trader, a modest vessel of 30 tons that sailed for Africa in 1709. This was the first step on the road which, by the end of the century, gained Liverpool the distinction of being the greatest slave trading port of the old world. Progress at first was slow. The town was more interested in the smuggling trade to the Spanish colonies and the tobacco trade. But according to an historian of the town, it soon forged ahead by its policies by cutting down expenses to the minimum, which enabled it to undersell its English and continental rivals. In 1730, it had 15 ships in the slave trade. In 1771, 7 times as many. The proportion of slave ships to the total shipping owned by the port was slightly over 1 in 100. In 1709, in 1730, it was 1/11. In 1763, 1/4. In 1771, 1/3. In 1795, Liverpool had 5/8 of the British slave trade and 3/7 of the whole European slave trade. The honors, quote unquote, of the Middle Passage have been exaggerated. For this, the British abolitionists are in large part responsible. There is something that smacks of ignorance and hypocrisy, or both, in the invectives heaped by these men upon a traffic which had in their day become less profitable and less vital to England. A Caribbean planter once reminded the Parliament that it ill became the elected representative of a country which had pocketed the gains from the slave trade to stigmatize it as a crime. The age which had seen the mortality among indentured servants saw no reason for squeamishness about the immorality among slaves. Nor did the exploitation of the slaves on the plantations differ fundamentally from the exploitations of the feudal peasants or the treatment of poor in European cities. Mutinies and suicides were obviously far more common on slave ships than on other vessels, and the brutal treatment of greater restrictions on the movements of the slaves would doubtless have tended to increase their mortality. Sorry. But the fundamental causes of this high mortality on the slave ship is on ships carrying indentured servants and even free passengers must be found firstly an endemics and inevitable results of the long voyages and the difficulty of preserving food and water, and second, in the practice of overcrowding the vessel. The sole aim of the slave merchant was to have their decks well covered with black ones. End quote. It is not uncommon to read a vessel of 90 tons carrying 390 slaves, or one of 100 tons carrying 414. Clarkson's investigation of Bristol's reveals a slope of 25 tons destined for 70 human beings, and another for a mere 11 tons of 30 slaves. The space allotted to each slave on the Atlantic crossing measured 5.5 feet in length by 16 inches in breadth, packed like, quote, rows of books on shelves, end quote. As Clarkson said, chained 2 by 2, right leg and left leg, right hand and left hand, which slave had less room than a man in a coffin. It was like the transportation of black cattle, and where sufficient black people were not available, cattle were taken on. The slave traders' aim was profit and not the comfort of his victims, and a modest measure in 1888 to regulate the transportation of the slaves in accordance with the capacity of the vessel invoked a loud howl from the slave traders. Quote, if the alteration takes place, wrote one of his agents, quote, it will hurt the trade, so hope you will make hay while the sun shines. The journal of one slave dealer during this residence in Africa admits that he had, quote, found no place in all these several countries of England, Ireland, America, Portugal, and Caribbees, and the Cape de Verde, the Azores, or all the places I have been in, where I can enlarge my fortunes so soon as where I now live. End quote. Money made the man. The prodigal who returned home empty-handed would have to be content with the common name of the M-word, which is half white, half black, biracial person, just come from Guinea. If, however, he returned with his pockets well stuffed with gold, quote, that very practical hides all other infirmities, then you will have heaps of friends in all kinds they're ongoing and waiting for your commands. Jesus. When you're known by the name of the African gentleman at every great man's house, and your discourse is set down as particular as Christopher Columbus expedition in America. That was weird. End quote. That was weird. About 1730 in Bristol, it was estimated that on a fortunate voyage, the profit on a cargo of about 270 slaves reached 7,000 or 8,000 pounds, exclusive of the returns from ivory. In the same year, the net return from the indifferent cargo, which arrived in poor conditions, was over 5,700 pounds. Profit of 100% were not uncommon in Liverpool, and one voyage netted a clear profit of at least 300%. The lively fitting out of 1737 with a cargo worth 1,307 pounds returned to Liverpool with colonial produce and bills of exchange totaling 3,080 pounds, in addition to cotton and sugar remitted later. The and other Liverpool ship sailed in 1751 with an outfit and a cargo costing 1,604 pounds. Altogether, the voyage produced 3,287 pounds net. The second voyage of 1753 produced 8,000 pounds on a cargo and outfitted amount of 3,153 pounds. An 18th century writer was estimated that the sterling value of the 330,737 slaves carried in 178 Liverpool ships between 1783 and 1793 at over 15 million pounds, deducting commissions and other charges and the cost of the outfit of the ships and maintenance of the slaves. He included that the average annual profit was over 30%. Modern scholarship has tended to reproach contemporary observers with undue exaggeration. But even taking the reduced estimate of Professor Dumbbell, that's the name, the net profit of the enterprise in 1803, estimated on cost of outfit and cost of cargo, was 38%, while that of the fortune of 1803 for a cargo of poor slaves was over 16%. Again, with these reduced estimates, the profit of the lottery in 1802 was 36 pounds per slave, and the enterprise 16 pounds, and the fortune 5. The slave trade, on the whole, was estimated to bring Liverpool alone in the 80s a clear profit of 300,000 pounds a year, and it was a common saying in the town of the far less profitable Caribbean trade that if one ship in 3 came in, a man was no loser, while if 2 came, if he was a good gainer. On an average, only one ship in 5 miscarried. Such profits seem small and insignificant compared with the fabulous 5,000% of the Dutch East India Company, clearly at times in its history. It is even probable that the profits from the slave trade were smaller than those made by the British East Indies Company. Yet these trades were far less important than the slave trade. The explanation lies in the fact that from the mercantilist standpoint, the Indian trade was a bad trade. It drains Britain of bullion to buy unnecessary wares, which led many at times to think that, quote, it were the happy thing for Christendom that the navigation to the West Indies by way of Cape of Good Hope had never been found out, end quote. The slave trade, on the contrary, was ideal in that it was carried on by means of British manufactured goods, and was, as far as the British colonies were concerned, inseparable connected with the plantation trade, which rendered Britain independent of foreigners for her supply of tropical products. The enormous profit of the Dutch spice trade, moreover, were based on a severe restriction of production to ensure high prices, whereas the slave trade created British industries at home in tropical agriculture in the colonies. The attractive African meteor, as a contemporary Liverpool historian called it, therefore became immensely popular, though a large part of the Liverpool slave traffic was monopolized by about 10 large firms. Many of the small vessels in the trade were fitted out by attorneys, drapers, grocers, barbers, and sailors. And tailors, sorry, not sailors, tailors. The share of the ventures were subdivided, one having 1/8, another 1/15, a third 1/3 second part of a share, and so on. Quote, almost every man in Liverpool is a merchant, and he who cannot send a bale will send a bandbox. Almost every order of people is interested in the Guinea cargo. It is to this influenza that there are so many small ships. The purchase of slaves called for the business sense and a shrewd discrimination. The Angola black person, who was a proverb for worthlessness, Cormantanis, Ashtanzis from the Gold Coast were good workers, but too rebellious. The Mandingolese, Senegal, were too prone to theft. The Igbos, Nigeria, were timid and despondent. The Pawpaws of Wadas, Dahomey, were the most docile and best disposed. The slaves were required for arduous field work. Hence, women and children were less valuable than robust males, the former because they were liable to interruptions from work through pregnancies, the latter because they require some attention until able to care for themselves. One Liverpool merchant cautioned his agents against buying ruptured slaves, unintelligent or any, old spider, legend quality. A Caribbean poet advised the slave trade to see that the slave's tongue was red, his chest broad, and his belly not prominent. By them young, consoled one overseas from Nevis. Quote, them full-grown fellers think it hard to work, never being brought up to it, they take it to heart, and die or is never good for anything. That's them, that's how they're talking. It's weird. It's fucking weird. Okay. But the slave trade was always a risky business. The African commerce, quote unquote, it was written in 1795, quote, holds forward on a constant train of uncertainty. The time of slaving is precarious, and the length of the middle passage uncertain. A vessel may be in part or wholly cut off. Mortalities may be great, and various other incidents may arise impossible to be foreseen, end quote. Sugar cultivation, moreover, was a lottery. The depths of the planters were bankruptcies, and demand for long credit gave the merchants many worries. Quote, as you know, end quote, wrote one of them, quick dispatch is the life of trade. I have had many anxious hours this year, and wouldn't not wish the same again for double the profits I may get, if any. From 1763 to 1778, the London merchants avoided all connections with the Liverpool slave traders, on the conviction that the slave trade was being conducted at a loss. Between 1772 and 1776, the Liverpool merchants were alleged to have lost £700,000. Of 30 leading houses which dominated the slave trade from 1773, 12 had by 1788 gone bankrupt, while many others had sustained considerable losses. The American Revolution seriously interrupted the trade. Quote, our once extensive trade to Africa is at a stand, lamented in Liverpool paper in 1775. Her gallant ships laid up and useless. Liverpool's slave trade turned to privateering, anxiously awaiting the return of peace, with never a thought that they were witnessing the death rattles of the old epic, of the birth pangs of a new. Prior to 1783, however, all classes in English society presented a unified front with regards to the slave trade. The monarchy, the government, the church, public opinion in general supported the slave trade. There were few protests, and those were ineffective. The Spanish monarchy set the fashion which European royalty followed to the very last. The palace fortresses of Madrid and Toledo were built out of the payment to the Spanish crown for a license to transport black people. One meeting of the two sovereigns of Spain and Portugal was held in 1701 to discuss the arithmetical problems posed by a contract for 10,000 tons of black people granted the Portuguese. The Spanish Queen Christina, in the middle of the 19th century, openly participated in the slave trade to Cuba. The royal court of Portugal, when it moved to Brazil to avoid capture by Napoleon, did not find the slave atmosphere of its colony territory and congenial. Louis the 14th fully appreciated the importance of the slave trade to metropolitan France and France overseas. The plan to the great elector for Persian aggrandizement included the African slave trade. Hawkins' slave trade expeditions was launched under the patrons of Queen Elizabeth. She expressed the hope that black people would not be carried off without their free consent, which, quote, would be detestable and call down the vengeance of heaven upon the undertakers. But there was as much possibility that the transportation of black people would be effected in democratic fashion as there was of collective bargaining. The Company of Royal Adventurers and the Royal African Company had as their names applied royal patrons, and not infrequently investments by members of the royal family. According to Wilberforce, George III later opposed abolition. The great was the joy of the Liverpool slave traders, the Jamaican sugar planters, when the Royal Duke of Clarence, the future William IV, quote, took up the cudgels against abolition, and attacking Wilberforce as either a fanatic or a hypocrite. The British government prior to 1783 was uniformly consistent in its encouragement of the slave trade. The first great rivals were the Dutch, who monopolized and carried trade to the British colonies. The bitter commercial warfare of the second half of the 17th century between England and Holland represented an effort on the part of England to break the commercial net of the Dutch, who had woven about England and her colonies. Quote, "What we want," said Monk with military bluntness, "is more of the trade the Dutch now have." Whether it was normal peace or actual war, a sort of private war was maintained for 30 years between the Dutch West Indian Company and the Royal African Company. England victory over Holland left her face to face with France. Anglo-French warfare, colonial and commercial, is the dominant theme in the history of the 18th century. It was a conflict of rival mercantilism. The struggle was fought out in the Caribbean, African, India, Canada, and on the banks of the Mississippi, from the privilege of the looting India and for the control of certain vital and strategic commodities, black people, sugar and tobacco, fish, furs, and naval stores. Of these areas, the most important were the Caribbean and Africa. Of these commodities, the most important were black people and sugar. The outstanding single issue was the control of the Asetio. This privilege was conceded to England by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 as one result of her victory in the War of the Spanish Succession, and produced popular rejoicing in the country. It was the proud boast of Catechism, and that his war with France had given England almost the entire control of the African coast and of the slave trade. Colonial assemblies frequently impeded the slave traders by imposing high duties on importing slaves, partly to raise revenue, partly out of their fear of the growing slave population. All such laws were frustrated by the home government on the assistance of British merchants who opposed taxes on British trade. The Board of Trade ruled in 1708 that it was absolutely necessary that a trade so beneficial to the kingdom should be carried on to the greatest advantage. The well supplying of the plantations and colonies with the sufficient number of black people at their reasonable prices is, in our opinion, the chief point to be considered. End quote. In 1773, the Jamaican Assembly, for the purpose of raising revenue and to reduce the fear of slave rebellions, imposed a duty on every black import. The merchants of London, Liverpool, and Bristol protested, and the Board of Trade condemned. The law was unjustifiable, improper, and prejudicial to British commerce. The governor was sharply reprimanded for his failure to stop efforts made to, quote, check the discourage a traffic so beneficial to the nation. As counsel for the sugar planters later argued, in every variation of our administration, the public affairs in every variation of the parties, the policy in respect that the trade has been the same in the very period of our history. In almost every variation of our politics, each side and description of party men have in turns approved this very trade, voted its encouragement, and considered it as a beneficial to the nation. Parliament appreciated the importance of slavery and the slave trade to Britain and her plantations. In 1750, Horace Walpole wrote scornfully of, quote, the British Senate, that temple of liberty, the bulwark of Protestant Christianity, pondering methods to make more effectual that horrid traffic of selling black people. Every time I say black people, they use N-words. So Parliament heard many debates in its stately halls over abolition and emancipation, and its record shows the doughty defenders the slave trade and the slave owners possessed. Among them was Edmund Burke, the champion of conciliation of America, was an accessory to the crucifixion of Africa. In 1772, a bill came before the House of Commons to prohibit the control of African committee by outsiders who were not engaged in the slave trade. Burke protests, not against the slave trade, however, but against depriving of the rights to vote those who had be legally purchased that right. Only a few, he argued, were so accused. Quote, ought we not rather to oh my gosh, that's the simple words. Hold on a second, let me get this word. Imitate the pattern set us and scared right, and if we find 10 just persons among them, to spare the whole? Let us not then counteract the wisdom of our ancestors, who considered and reconsidered the subject, nor place upon the footing of a monopoly that was intended for a free trade. End quote. Bristol could well afford to share in the general admiration of the great liberal. The church also supported the slave trade. The Spaniards saw it in an opportunity of converting the heathens, and the Jesuits, Dominicans, and Franciscans were heavily involved in sugar cultivation, which meant slave holding. The story is told of an old elder of the church in Newport who would invariably, the Sunday following the arrival of a slaver from the coast, thank God that, quote, another cargo of benighted beings had been brought to a land where they could have the benefit of a gospel dispensation. But in general, the British planters opposed Christianity for their slaves. It made them more perverse and intractable, and therefore less valuable. It meant also instructions in the English language, which allowed diverse tribes to get together and plot sedition. There were more material reasons for this opposition. The governor of Barbados in 1695 was shocked by the planters' rejection of the proposal to give black people one day in the week in order to permit the abolition of Black Sunday market. The church obediently toed the line. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel prohibited Christianity instructions to its slaves in Barbados and branded society on its new slave to distinguish them from those of the laity. The original slaves were the legacy of Christopher Cordington, and Sherlock, later Bishop of London, assured the planters that Christianity and the embracing of the gospel does not make the least difference in civil property. Neither did it impose by barriers of clerical activity. For his labor with regards to the acento, which he helped to draw up as a British, I'm gonna look up this word. Hello, we're not getting a lot of coins, my friend. We can try, but we're not getting anything. Here you go. We'll try, but don't be surprised if you don't get any coins. Ash has been here about almost an hour now. About 45 minutes. Oh, there it is. Please let me say it.
Plenipotentiary.
Plenipotentiary. Oh my gosh. A person, usually a diplomat, who has full power and authority to act, negotiate, and sign agreements on behalf of their government without the needing to check back for approval. At Urk is a city in the Netherlands, because I've been there. Bishop Robinson of Bristol was promoted to the see of London. The bells of the Bristol church pealed merely on the news of the rejection of the Parliament of Wilberforce bill for the abolition of the slave trade. The slave trade, John Newton gave thanks to the Liverpool churches for the success of this last venture before the conversation and implored God's blessing on his next. He established public worship twice every day on his slaver, obfuscating himself, and kept a day of fasting and prayer, not for the slaves, but for the crew. Quote, I never knew, he confessed, sweeter or more frequent hours of divine communion than in the last 2 voyages in Guinea. The famous Cardinal Manning of the 19th century was the son of a rich Caribbean merchant dealing in slave-grown produce. Many missionaries found it profitable to drive out Beelzebub. According to the most recent English writer of the slave trade, they, quote, considered that the best way in which to remedy abuse of black slaves was to set the plantation owners a good example by keeping slaves and estates themselves, accomplishing in this practical manner the salvation of the planters and the advancement of their foundations. The Moravian missionaries in the islands held slaves without hesitation. The Baptists, one historian writes, with charming delicacy, would not allow their earlier missionaries to deprecate ownership of slaves. To the very end, the bishop of Exeter, EXETR, retained his 655 slaves, for whom he received over 12,700 pounds compensation in 1833. Wild. Church historians make awkward apologies that conscience awoke very slowly to the appreciation of the wrongs inflicted by slavery, and that the defense of slavery by churchmen, quote, simply arose from want of delicacy. No, it's not delicacy. I'm gonna look this word up. Make sure I'm saying it right. Sorry, I do whistling because I get weird. Making sure I'm saying this word.
Delicacy.
Oh, I'm saying it right. Delicacy of moral perception. There is no need to make such apologies. The attitude of the churchman was the attitude of the layman. The 18th century, like any other century, could not raise above its economic limitations. As Whitefield argued in advocating the repeal of that article of the Georgia Charter, which forbade slavery, quote, "It is plain to demonstration that hot countries cannot be cultivated without black people." Jesus Christ. Quaker nonconformity did not extend to the slave trade. In 1756, there were 84 Quakers listed as members of the company trading of Africa, among them the Barclay and Baring families. Slave dealing was one of the most lucrative investments of English as an American Quaker, and the name of a slaver, the willing Quaker, reported from Boston at Sierra Leone in 1793, symbolizes the approval that which the slave trade was regarded in Quaker circles. The Quakers' opposition to the slave trade came first and largely not from England, but from America, and there from the small rural communities of the North, independent of slave labor. It is difficult, writes Dr. Gary, to avoid the assumption that opposition to the slave system was at first confined to a group who gained no direct advantage from it, and consequently possessed an objective attitude. The Navy was expressed. The Navy was expressed with the value of the West, the Caribbean colonies, and refused to hazard or jeopardize their security. The Caribbean stations was the station of honor, and many an admiral had been feted by the slave owners. Rodney opposed abolition. Earl St. Vincent pleaded that life on the plantation was for black people a veritable paradise as compared with his existence in Africa. What? Oh, that's disgusting. Abolition was a, quote, damned and accursed doctrine held only by hypocrites. The gallant admiral's sentiments were not entirely divorced from more material consideration. He received over 6,000 pounds compensation in 1837 for their ownership of 418 slaves in Jamaica. Nelson's wife was a Caribbean, and his view on the slave trade was unequivocal. And I have a visibility restriction. Whatever. Kiss my ass. I don't care. Kiss my ass. Oh my god. Can someone tell me what page I was on, please? I just lost it. Someone tell me what page I was on, please. Just lost it. I lost it. $65? I hope so. Because I just hit something and for some reason it went right down to the bibliography. 65, huh? You think? Yeah. I hate when I do that. Oh, look, it's Bree. Well, okay, I got that. I did that one. The Quaker thing. No, I'm going to start from here. I'm going to read 64 again. Quaker nonconformity. Let's just start there. Did not extend to the slave trade. In 1756, there were 84 Quakers listed as members of the company trading to Africa, among them the Barclay and Baring families. Slave dealing was one of the most lucrative investments of English as American Quakers, and the name of a slaver, the willing Quaker, reported from Boston at Sierra Leone in 1793, symbolized the approval with which the slave trade was regarded in Quaker circles. The Quaker opposition to the slave trade came first and largely not from England, but from America, and there from the small rural communities of the North, independent of slave labor. It is difficult, writes Dr. Gary, to avoid the assumption that opposition to the slave system was at first confined to a group who gained no direct advantage from it and consequently possessed the objective attitude. The Navy was impressed with the value of the Caribbean colonies and refused to hazard or jeopardize their security. The Caribbean stations was the station of honor, and many an admiral had been feted by the slave owners. Rodney opposed abolition. Earl St. Vincent pleaded that life on plantation was for black people a veritable paradise as compared with his existence in Africa. Abolition was a, quote, damned and cursed doctrine held only by hypocrites. The gallant admiral's sentiments were not entirely divorced from more material considerations. He received over 6,000 pound compensation in 1837 for the ownership of 418 slaves in Jamaica. Nelson's wife was a Caribbean, and his view on the slaves trade were unequivocal. It was bred in the good old schools and taught to appreciate the values of our Caribbean possessions, and neither in the field nor in the Senate shall their just rights be infringed, while I have an arm to fight in their defense, or a tongue to launch my voice against the damnable doctrine of Wilberforce and his hypocritical allies. Slavery existed under the very eyes of 18th century Englishmen. The English coin, the guinea, rare though I was and is, had its origin in the trade to Africa. The Westminster goldsmiths made several pocket locks for black people and dogs, busts of black Moors and elephants, emblematical of the slave trade, adorned the Liverpool Town Hall. The insignia and equipment of the slave traders were boldly exhibited for sale in the shops and advertised in the press. Slaves were sold openly at auctions, slaves being valuable property with title recognized by law. The postmaster was the agent employed on the occasion to recapture runaway slaves, and the advertisements were published in the official organs of the government. Black servants were common. Little black boys were the appendage of slave captains. Fashionable ladies or women were easy virtue. Haggard's heroine in the harlot progress to attend by a black boy, and Marguerite Steins. These are people's names. Arabella Brewmaster typifies 18th century English opinion in her desire for a little black boy whom she could love as her long-haired kitten. Oh my God. Freed black people were conspicuous among London's beggars and were known as St. Gillies blackbirds. So numerous were they that the Parliamentary Committee was set up in 1786 for relieving the black poor. Slaves cannot breathe in England, wrote the poet Cowper. This was license of the poet. It was held in 1677 that black people, being usually bought and sold among merchants, so merchandise, and also being infidels, there might be a property in them. In 1729, the Attorney General ruled the baptism did not bestow freedom or make any alterations to the temporal conditions of the slave. In addition, the slaves did not become free by being brought to England, and once in England, the owners could legally compel his return to the plantation. So eminent an authority as Sir William Blackstone held that, quote, with respect of any right the master may have lawfully acquired to the perpetual service of John or Thomas, this will remain exactly in the same state of subjection for life in England and elsewhere. Hey, look, I got approved. Oh, you're awake. Are you awake? Oh, Tiger went order food? Okay. That's cool. When therefore the odious zeal of Grenville Sharp brought before Chief Justice Mansfield in 1772 the case of a black James Somerset, who was about to be returned to his owner to Jamaica, there were abundant precedents to prove the impurity of the English heir. Mansfield tried hard to evade the issue of suggesting manumissions of the slave and contented himself with the modest statement that the case was not quote allowed or approved by the law of England, and black people must be discharged. Much has been made of this case by people constantly seeking for triumphs in humanitarianism. Professor Copeland contends that behind the legal judgment lay the moral judgment, and that of Somerset case marked the beginning of the end of slavery throughout the British Empire. This is merely poetic sentimentality translated into modern history. Benjamin Franklin pointed scornfully to, quote, the hypocrisy of this country which encourages such a detestable commerce, while it piqued itself on its virtue, love of liberty, and the equality of its courts, is setting free a single black person. 2 years after Somerset case, the British government disallowed the Jamaican Acts restricting the slave trade in 1783. The Quaker petition for abolition was solemnly rejected by Parliament. Hello. Yeah. In 1783, moreover, the same Mansfield handed down a decision in the case of the ship Zong. Short of water, the captain had thrown 132 slaves overboard, and now the owner brought an action of insurance alleging that the loss of the slaves fell within the clause of the policy which insured against perils of the sea. Oh yeah, we're doing good. The Mansfield case of the slaves was the same as if the horses had been thrown overboard. Damages of 30 pounds were awarded for each slave, and the idea that the captain and the crew would be prosecuted for mass homicide never entered into the head of any humanitarian. In 1785, another insurance case involving a British ship, a mutiny among the slaves, came before Mansfield. His Daniel judgment was that all the slaves who were killed in the mutiny or had died of their wounds and bruises were to be paid for by the underwriters. Those who had died from jumping overboard or from swallowing water or from charging were not to be paid for on the ground that they had not died from injuries received in the mutiny, and the underwriters were not responsible for any depreciation in price which resulted to the survivors from the mutiny. Oh yay, look, I got another one. They don't like me talking about slavery, I guess, huh? The prosecution of the slave trade was not the work of the dreads of English society. The daughters of the slave traders was assured us that her father, though a slave captain and a privateer, was a kind of just man, a good father, husband, and friend. It was probably true. The men most active in this traffic were worthy men, fathers of families, and excellent citizens. The abolition's Ramsay acknowledged this with real sorrow, but pleaded that, quote, they had never examined the nature of this commerce and went into it, and acted as others had done before, course, for which no account was to be given in this world or the next. The apology is unnecessary. The slave trade was a branch of trade, and a very important branch. An officer in the trade once said that, quote, one real view, 1 minute absolute spent in the slave rooms on the Middle Passage would do more for the cause of humanity than the pen of the Robertson, or the whole collective eloquence of the British Senate. This is dubious, as it was argued later about the Cuban and Brazilian slave trade. It was no use saying it was an unholy or unchristian occupation. It was a lucrative trade, and that was enough. The slave trade has even been justified as a great education. Quote, think of the effect, the result of a slave voyage, on a youngster's starting in his teens. What an education was such a voyage for a farm lad. What an enlargement of experience for a country boy. If he returned to the farm, his whole outlook on life would be changed. He went out a boy and returned a man. Slave traders were among the leading humanitarians of their age. John Carey, advocated of the slave trade, was conspicuous for his integrity and humanity, and was the founder of a society known as the Incorporation of the Poor. The Bristol slaver, Southwell, was named after a Bristol parliamentarian whose monument depicts him as true to king and country and steady to what he thought right. Brian Blundell of Liverpool, one of Liverpool's most prosperous merchants, engaged in both the slave and Caribbean trades, was for many years trustee, treasurer, chief patron, and most active supporter in the charity schools, in a charity school, the Blue Coat Hospital, founded in 1709. To this charity, another Liverpool slave trader, Foster Cunliffe, contributed largely. He was a pioneer in the slave trade. He and his two sons were listed as members of the Liverpool Committee of Merchants trading to Africa in 1752. Together they had 4 ships capable of holding 1,120 slaves, the profit from which were sufficient to stock 12 vessels on a homeward journey with sugar and rum. An inscription to Foster's Cunliffe in St. Peter's Church describes him thus: a Christian devout and exemplary in the exercise of every private and public duty, friend to mercy, patron of distress, an enemy only to vice and sloth. He lived esteemed by all who knew him, and died lamented by the wise and good. It's because people didn't care about black people. That's why. They just saw the outcomes and getting like, oh my gosh. Thomas Leyland, one of the largest slave traders of the same port, had as mayor no mercy for the engrosser and for Stoller, the regrator, and was a terror to evildoers. The Haywoods were slave traders and the first to import the slave-grown cotton of the United States. Arthur Hayward was treasurer of the Manchester Academy, where his sons were educated. One son, Benjamin, was elected member of the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester and was admitted to the billiard club, the most Richard Club Manchester has ever possessed, which admitted only the very best men as regards manners, positions, and attainments, to be admitted to the charmed circle of the 40 meant unimpeachable recognition as a gentleman. Later, Benjamin Hayward organized the first of the Manchester expositions of works of arts and industry. These slave traders held high offices in England, the Royal Adventurers trading to Africa in 1667. A list headed by royalty included 2 aldermen, 3 dukes, 8 earls, 7 lords, 1 countess, and 27 knights. The signatures of the mayors of Liverpool and Bristol appear on the petitions of the slave traders in 1739. The Bristol Committee, set up in 1789 to oppose abolition of the slave trade, included 5 aldermen, one an ex-captain of a slaver, Many a slave trade held Liverpool's highest municipal dignity. The slave traders were firmly established in both houses of Parliament. Ellis Cunliffe, I can't say his name, represented Liverpool in Parliament from 1755 to 1767. The Talenton family, prominent in the slave trade, voiced Liverpool's opposition to abolition in the Parliament. The House of Lords, traditionally conservative, was confirmed in its instinctive opposition to abolition by the presence of many ennobled slave traders. It gave sympathetic hearing to the Earl of Westmoreland's statement that many of them owed their seats in the upper house to the slave trade, and that abolition was Jacobinism. No wonder Wilberforce feared the upper chamber. Not without confidence did the Assembly of Jamaican state categorically in 1792 that, quote, the safety of the Caribbean not only depends on the slave trade not being abolished, but on a speedy declaration of the House of Lords that they will not suffer the trade to be abolished. Hold on a second. Hey, I got approved again. Look at me getting approved. Just kidding. Hold on. 68. And look ahead here. Oh, okay. Great. We'll stop on chapter 3. 68. Some protests were voiced by a few 18th century intellectuals and prelates. Defoe, in his Reformation and Manners, condemned the slave trade. The poet Thompson, in his Summer, drew a lurid picture of the shark following the wake of the slave ships. Cowper, after some hesitation, wrote his memorable lines in, quote, The Task. Blake wrote his beautiful poem on the, quote, Little Black Boy. Southey composed some poignant verses on the quote, the sailor who had served in the slave trade. But much of this 18th century literature was Professor Cipher has shown in an exhaustive analysis concentrated on the noble black person, the prince unjustly made captive superior, even in bondage to his captors. This sentimentally typical of the 18th century in general, more often than not, carried a vicious implication that the slavery of the ignoble black person was justified. Boswell, on the other hand, stated emphatically that to abolish the slave trade was to shut the gate of mercy on mankind, and dubbed Wilberforce a, quote, dwarf with big resounding name. Two 18th century merchants, Bentley and Roscoe, opposed the slave trade before 1783. They were more than merchants. They were Liverpool merchants. The two 18th century economists condemned the expensiveness and the inefficiency of slave labor. Dean Tucker and Adam Smith, the warning Tuscan, the trumpeter of the New Age, the discordant. Another one, I have to do this again. Discordant notes went unheeded. The 18th century endorsed the plea of Temple Literal. Some gentlemen may indeed object to the slave trade as inhuman and impious. Let us consider that if our colonies are to be maintained and cultivated, which can only be done by African black people, it is surely better to supply ourselves with those laborers in British bottoms, which purchase them through the medium of French, Dutch, and Danish factors. On one occasion, the Mauritanian gentleman, eager to convince the abolitionist Buxton that, quote, black people were the happiest people in the world, appealed to his wife to confirm his statement for her own impression of the slaves she had seen. Well, yes, replied the good spouse. They were very happy, I'm sure, only I used to think it so odd to see a black black cooks chained to the fireplace. Only a few Englishmen before 1783, like the good spouse, had any doubts about the morality of the slave trade. Those who had realized that objection was, oh my gosh, Postowitho put it, would be a little weight with statesmen who saw the great national, oh my gosh, I gotta look at this word. There it is. Oh, la 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 la. E-M. Let's look this up. Emoluments, which accrued from the slave trade. We shall take things as they are, and reason from them in their present state, and not from that wherein we could hope them to be. We could not think of giving up the slave trade, notwithstanding my good wishes that it could be done. Later, perhaps some noble and benevolent Christian's spirit might think of chaining the system, which as things are now, circumstances may not be so easily brought about. Before the American Revolution, English public opinion in general accepted the view of the slave trader, though tout traffic in human creatures may at first sight appear barbarous, inhuman, and unnatural. Yet the traders herein have as much to plead in their own excuse as can be said for some other branches of trade, namely the advantage of it. In a word, from this trade process benefits far outweighing all either real or pretended mischiefs and inconveniences. And that's where we'll stop. We'll stop at chapter 3, British commerce and the triangular trade. We'll stop here. Oh my God. Oh God. Add a bookmark. All right, we're stopping on number 70, page 70, the triangular trade. It's like parallel with other like books we've read about the slave trade and stuff. This just seems more in detail about who, when, where, and how and why. 70, page 70. All right, everybody. I appreciate whoever came and listened to my stumbling around and reading. I appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and close it off. I appreciate it. I know that we couldn't get too much coins up here, but maybe next time, guys. I'm so sorry. Anyways.